During World War II, there were many different countries that fell under the occupation of the Nazis and the Germans. Inside of these lands, people were terrorised and were subjected to brutal treatment. There were often bodies hanging from lampposts inside cities and towns, and the Germans wanted to strike fear into the hearts of every person. Many were sent to concentration camps after being rounded up, but lots of women were targeted and were subjected to horrific treatment and ordeals at the hands of the different occupying forces. This was not just the Germans who targeted women. The Soviets and the other Allied nations subjected women to terrible treatment. In France, for example, the liberating French resistance even terrorised women for allegedly sleeping with the enemy, and they subjected them to the ugly carnival. In this video we will look at the experiences of women all over Europe and the Pacific during World War II, and look at how they were treated in some of the most harrowing ways. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. As the Germans captured and seized large areas of land in different countries, they settled and occupied the areas. Quickly they got themselves comfortable, and then started looking for women to either court, take advantage of, or treat terribly. There were many women across occupied lands who took to the Germans, and who decided to sleep with German soldiers. There was at the time sometimes in the German army seemingly a trend where many of the French girlfriends of German soldiers would walk around in their boyfriends' uniforms, and pictures of this do exist. Everyone in the Wehrmacht and the military knew that Paris was where they wanted to be. Many Germans believed that it was a place filled with scandalous women who would tend to every desire of the army, and they believed it was in a sense a giant cat house. Conquering soldiers, especially those who were of a significant rank in the military, did have a lot to offer a girl. They could offer them a future. They promised that after the war they would marry and then move back to Germany and start a family. There were some women who did take advantage of the fact many German soldiers were lonely, and then went to bed with them, but there were also some soldiers who were too happy to take advantage of the women in France, many whose boyfriends and husbands had joined the French army to fight. Some women fell in love and married their German boyfriends, and they followed their husbands wherever they went, even across dangerous lands, and some even joined them inside of prison camps. In France, around 200,000 babies were born to German fathers and French mothers, and this pattern occurred wherever the German army went. In Norway, 12,000 were born, and even on the Channel Islands, 900 babies were born to German fathers, and these were registered. But as the war turned against the Germans and they were pushed back and forced to concede territory, often the liberators and aspects of the resistance went to extreme lengths to punish those women who they believed were collaborating with the Germans and who had slept with the enemy. Horizontal collaboration, as it was known, referred to a romantic or sexual relationship that many women in France or occupied lands had with German occupation forces following the fall of said lands. After the liberation of France, many women were punished in a horrific ordeal for being collaborators, and many of the scenes were truly horrific and barbarous. In Norway, some women who were accused of collaborating in this way were exiled from lands, and were even arrested and thrown in prison. Also, children from these relationships were considered part of the betrayal, and were also exiled and declared illegitimate. In many lands, to sleep with the enemy was considered one of the worst shames and crimes that one could conduct during the Second World War. But in France, a horrific ordeal for many women was carried out, aimed to torture and humiliate them in public for sleeping with their enemies. Many had their heads shaved in public spectacles, with crowds flocking to see members of the resistance cutting the flowing locks from a woman. This was a punishment that dated back to the Dark Ages for adultery, but it was a sign of humiliation and retribution for the French forces. During the Second World War, the Nazi state issued orders that German women who were accused of sleeping with non-Aryans or foreign prisoners on farms should be publicly punished with their heads shaved. But inside French towns, the scenes were incredibly shocking, with crowds baying for the sadistic punishment of the women. The ugly carnival, as it was referred to, saw a large number of women brought into town squares, forced to have their heads shaved, and then they were often beaten, hit and abused by other members of the crowds. Crowds would spit and throw things at them, and often they had punishment inflicted upon them. Many were stripped half naked and forced to walk the streets, where crowds would kick and hit them, and beat them sometimes very severely. Some women were badly beaten and bloodied by these attacks, and some were even covered in tar to shame them and make them feel worse and outline what they had done. Many of the women in act of revenge also had a swastika drawn on their foreheads or bodies in lipstick or paint, and this showed the whole crowd what they'd done. It was said that these women, in the hands of their tormentors, had the look of a hunted animal, and that the French were rounding up collaborators, cutting their hair off and burning it in huge piles, which one could smell miles away. Also, women collaborators were forced to run the gauntlet and were really beaten. One photographer who took a picture of these events wrote, "I saw 4 girls who had been led through the streets and I rushed towards them to take a photograph. At once I found myself at the front of the procession, and the local people thought I was the female soldier who had captured them or something like that, and I was kissed and congratulated at the same time, as slaps and spit rained down on the unfortunate girls." Many of the women were also paraded on lorries throughout towns and cities to show more people what they'd done. Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, saw this and stated, "I watched an open lorry drive past, to the accompaniment of boos and catcalls from the French people, with a dozen miserable women in the back. Every hair on their head had been shaved off. They were in tears, hanging their heads in shame. Whilst disgusted by this cruelty, I reflected that we British had not known invasion or occupation for some 900 years, so we were not the best judges." There were also a few men who were shaved for working in German factories, but it was always women who were deemed the first scapegoats. A number of these women were not actually guilty of sleeping with the enemy, but some were wrongly subjected to the ordeal, as they were in conflict with another woman or a man who would tell the resistance on them. A number of women who were also shamed were also abused by the German soldiers, and these scenes of public humiliation were played out all over France. Much of France had suffered under the German occupation heavily, and some Allied soldiers were sympathetic to this, but were still shocked by the torture of the women that was evident. Many women were executed and shot dead by French forces if they were found with German weapons in their possession, even before they had a chance to explain, such was the fear of collaboration. There was a possibility that these weapons were being gathered for the resistance, but soldiers still shot women and also men dead for this. There was also a fear in France of French women supporting the German military, as one report from an American lieutenant of the 1st Infantry Division claimed he had encountered 4 women in German uniforms as snipers in trees, and 5 inside of a town. But many women were targeted as during the occupation they had lived better lives than the rest of the French population, as they had not starved and had been given better food and received many benefits from going with a German soldier, such as trips to different places, and also more lenient treatment by other German officers. It's known that at least 20,000 women were known to have had their heads shaved, and this figure may be higher. In Paris, things were much more extreme, as there were cases of prostitutes and women being kicked to death for accepting German soldiers as clients, and even members of the aristocracy were shaved for being in cahoots with German officers. In some areas of France, much of the conduct of French women and German soldiers was professional. Some women, for example female schoolteachers, who were living alone, were forced to have German soldiers living with them. After the war, these were allegedly punished for laying with German soldiers, but this was not the case in many of them. Many women believed their only way of obtaining food for themselves and their children during the occupation was to collaborate with the enemy. But the scenes of the ugly carnival were one of the most shocking of the Second World War, as the violence inflicted upon the women, who were forced to run the gauntlet in towns, or were shaved, sometimes resulted in their deaths and killings. Across France, there was a great moral outrage on these women who had slept with the enemy, and for this their conduct was regarded as the biggest shame imaginable and tantamount to treason. The scenes played out in many French settlements brought great shock to even the most hardened Allied soldier, and today the images of French women without hair and with swastikas branded on them are incredibly haunting. It wasn't just in the army that women in the Soviet Union saw combat. There were a group of Soviet women aviators, and when the war broke out, there were a number of women who had training as pilots, and many of them volunteered to fight. There were no formal limits to their applications to serve in combat roles, but women were discouraged from taking to the skies or bearing arms for their country, until there was a desperate need for them. Their applications were initially blocked and were put off, until the true reality of the conflict hit Stalin, and the fact his soldiers had taken huge losses as the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Stalin's lands. The Soviet Union was the first nation which used women pilots to fly combat missions, and there were complete regiments of them that flew more than 30,000 combat sorties, and many of these women were awarded the prestigious Hero of the Soviet Union award. Famously, the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment was known as the Night Witches, and these women flew around 24,000 combat missions, bombing the Germans from an outdated biplane. During some of these missions, they were known for terrorising the German lines. They would fly at high altitude, and would then turn off their engines and then glide to a bombing altitude. With no engine sound, they were ghost-like, and when they hit the right altitude, they would drop their payload and cause havoc and confusion amongst the Germans. But the fighting on the Eastern Front was some of the most savage and deadly of the whole of World War II. As the Soviets took heavy losses at the hands of the Germans to begin with, Stalin had to consider how he would replace many of the men that he had lost. Some of his best officers were lost early in this manner, and he planned that women would then take part in the second line of defence, and would be trained in medical aid and nursing in aid stations, but also manning anti-aircraft positions. These roles were seen as safer than the front lines, but eventually the time came where women were to be involved in the combat. Women eventually gained a significant amount of credibility inside of the Red Army, and it's believed that around 500,000 towards the end of the war were involved. Another significant role for women was as snipers, and some of the best known female soldiers had incredible records with their rifles. Rosa Shanina, for example, was credited with 59 confirmed kills, and many women were used at Stalingrad to snipe the enemy. Some female snipers crept inside of the ruined city and took out the enemy with precision. Between 1941 and 1945, almost 2,500 Soviet female snipers were deployed, and around 500 survived the conflict, and they killed at least 11,000 members of the enemy. Also, Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko was another sniper who is classed as the most successful female sniper in history, as she managed to take out a staggering 309 German soldiers. She was known for her immense skill and was a constant thorn in the side of the Wehrmacht. But the German army saw the use of female Soviet Red Army soldiers as wrong and backwards, and they were seen as a symbol of communism. The Germans saw the women as evil, and they thought a woman's place should be in the home, and these strong views needed stamping out in the eyes of the military. For the Nazis, the use of women on the battlefield was completely against their beliefs, and because of this they were seen as the lowest of the low, and were often subject to immediate execution as soon as they were captured. Hitler was concerned that this sort of behaviour in his eyes would spread, so he ordered his soldiers to deal with them quickly. It wasn't just the Nazis who believed this, but the Wehrmacht in the German army also saw this as shocking. The commander of the Fourth Army at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, Gunther von Kluge, stated in his order that all women found in uniform were to be shot in line with the Nazi beliefs. He considered that female fighters were seen as a barbaric element of Bolshevism, but despite this order later being taken back, there was a huge amount of cruelty inflicted on female soldiers. Other significant officers inside of the German army continued to give out instruction as to how to brutally deal with the women on the battlefield that were captured. They were considered as equal to the Soviet commissars, who, as the commissar order stated from the Nazi government, should be shot dead as soon as they were captured. They were not to be given a trial, but instead were to be immediately be shot by a firing squad, or simply any officer who took them prisoner. It was deemed that the women who took up arms against them should not be given a choice to live out more days inside of a concentration camp or a prisoner of war camp, but should have their lives taken away straight away. Some women were not even given firing squads, and many were hanged from the nearest tree or in gallows constructed inside of villages and towns. The remains of these women were then often left for days on end to send a clear message to anyone who passed by, seeing them. Many of the women who were captured were executed en masse, and specific German units committed many war crimes. Some were eventually transported to concentration camps, such as Ravensbrück, the largest all-female camp, but this was only a very small percentage. But many women also were encouraged to join the Soviet partisans, and this resistance element was very successful in carrying out sabotage and demolition jobs towards the enemy. But the Germans dealt very strongly with partisans, especially the women. For example, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was an 18-year-old girl who was arrested by the Nazis following being captured during a combat mission near to a village. She was beaten daily and was tortured and humiliated, but she gave over no information. Because of this, she was then dragged out to a gallows in front of a large crowd, who witnessed her final moments. She cried out, "There are 2 million of us, you can't hang us all." Then the noose was fastened and the stool kicked out from underneath her. Also, Zinaida Portnova was just a young girl of 15 when she joined the Soviet partisans. She hid weapons and was involved in sabotage, but when she was captured, she was interrogated and tortured. She managed to shoot one of her captors, but was brutally assaulted and tortured for hours inside of a forest before she was then shot in the head by SS officers while she knelt at their feet. So if a female Soviet Red Army military soldier fell into the hands of the enemy, then there was a very probable chance that they would be executed very quickly. The fact that women were allowed to fight in the Red Army alongside men showed that Stalin's need for fighters was a huge one, but there are many women who were killed in the Second World War whose story remains untold. There are undoubtedly Red Army soldiers who are women still interred on the battlefields of the Second World War, and many were killed in war crimes that the Nazis justified with their ideology and social beliefs. On the 20th of April 1945, and Hitler's 56th birthday, the Soviet artillery rang around Berlin, and the city continued to be hit heavily until its surrender. There was a huge amount of Soviet artillery fired during the Battle of Berlin, and the Soviet plan was to encircle the city. It was 2 days later where Hitler flew into a blind fit of rage when he realised that the plans to attempt a German breakout had not occurred, as the city was suffering heavily, and it was then when he declared that the war was over, and he blamed his generals for this. Joseph Goebbels ordered propaganda to continue to be spread to try and defend the city, and even young boys were armed with Panzerfaust and explosives to repel the Soviets. It was said, on the walls of the houses we saw Goebbels' appeals, hurriedly scrawled in white paint. "Every German will defend his capital. We shall stop the red hordes at the walls of our Berlin. Just try and stop them. Steel pillboxes, barricades, mines, traps, suicide squads with grenades clutched in their hands. All are swept aside before the tidal wave. Drizzling rain began to fall. Near Beersdorf, I saw batteries preparing to open fire. Where are the targets? I asked the battery commander. Centre of Berlin, Spree bridges, and the Northern and Stettin railway stations, he answered. Then came the tremendous words of the command. Open fire on the capital of fascist Germany. I noted the time. It was exactly 8:30 a.m. on the 22nd of April. 96 shells fell in the centre of Berlin in the course of a few minutes. As soon as the Soviets were advancing, reports were going back to Moscow about the behaviour of the Soviet forces. It was said that many Germans declared that all German women in East Prussia who stayed behind were assaulted by the Red Army soldiers. An order number 006 was issued in an attempt to direct the feelings of hatred at fighting the enemy on the battlefield rather than committing assaults against civilians. This had little effect, and there was a complete lack of discipline inside the Red Army. The calls to avenge the motherland, which the Soviets felt had been violated by the German invasion, in the Soviet soldiers' opinions, gave them in their minds permission to do what they wanted inside of Germany. It was said by one soldier that our soldiers' behaviour towards Germans, particularly German women, is absolutely correct, and many believed it was amusing what they were doing. It was completely sick, and it was said that many Soviet women who served inside of the Red Army even watched as the men assaulted and killed many women. It was said in 1945 that the Russian soldiers were assaulting every German female from 8 to 80. Many of the Soviet soldiers were often drinking heavily also, and were drinking anything they could get their hands on. It's believed this gave them the courage to attack women further, and many women were subject also to violence at the hands of these drunken men. They rampaged across Germany, assaulting and abusing wherever they went, and it's believed that 2 million children were born to unwanting German women who had been subject to horrific ordeals at the hands of the Red Army forces. They did not discriminate with age, and many older women were also subject to horrific ordeals, and these were completely helpless. Many Red Army soldiers wanted to humiliate the German women as an act of revenge, and as the Red Army reached Berlin, they regarded women as a right of conquest that they could simply take like sick plunder. It was said by one Soviet general that a group of 35 provisional lieutenants on a course and their battalion commander entered a women's dormitory. and then they carried out horrific crimes there. But in Berlin, the stories of the Red Army soldiers had been told by Joseph Goebbels, who had distributed propaganda about the horror of the Red Army. Many believed that despite what had happened in the countryside, this sort of behaviour could not have been done inside of Berlin, but the Red Army rampaged throughout the city. One man who was stationed near the city of Berlin summed up the Red Army's attitude towards women. When his soldiers encountered a group of German women fighters, he said, the captured German female cats declared they were avenging their dead husbands. They must be destroyed without mercy. Our soldiers suggested stabbing them, but I would just execute them. This same Soviet soldier later wrote, once he reached Berlin, that he came across a group of German women who were carrying suitcases and other items. He asked where they were going, and he said that, with horror on their faces, they told me what had happened on the first night of the Red Army's arrivals. In one area of Berlin, Soviet officers visited a sister, the mother superior of a maternity clinic and orphanage. The officers themselves behaved well and warned the women of the second line of soldiers and what they would do. These officers were right, and when the second line arrived at the house, nuns, young women, old women, pregnant women and mothers who had just given birth were subject to horrific ordeals. As the city of Berlin was crumbling, Soviet soldiers found many of the air raid shelters and then flashed their torches in the face of many of the women before they were then grabbed out of the shelters and selected to be victims. The women of Berlin were being treated as spoils of war, who the soldiers took their anger out and rage on. Many women were forced to try and become friendly with one Soviet soldier so they would protect them from other members of the Red Army. For example, Magda Wiedeland, a 24-year-old actress, was dragged from a cupboard where she hid, and a soldier from Central Asia found her. She offered to be his girlfriend if he would protect her from other Russians, but instead he boasted to his friends, then they assaulted her en masse. Many women had to disappear during what they deemed was the hunting hours, where the Soviets would look for any women. They saw the safer hours as the early morning, when they were hungover and sleeping, and many mothers gave themselves up to save their daughters. Many women who live in Berlin today can still recall the horror and the screams of those nights, and as many of the windows had been blown up through the artillery, everything could be heard. The city's hospitals had to deal with many victims of the Red Army, and one doctor believed that around 100,000 women had been assaulted in Berlin, but 10,000 women had died from their ordeals, or the fact they took their lives after the horror they were subjected to. It's believed that 2 million women at least were assaulted by Red Army soldiers across Germany. Men who tried to defend women against Soviet attackers were shot dead and were killed and executed in brutal ways. Following the fall of the city, onlookers noted that out of desperation and for food, many of Berlin's women sold themselves for food and other luxuries such as cigarettes, which were being used inside the city as currency. One woman who lived during the Battle of Berlin said, "The next morning, we women proceeded to make ourselves look as unattractive as possible to the Soviets by smearing our faces with coal dust and covering our heads with old rags, our makeup for the Ivan. We huddled together in the central part of the basement, shaking with fear, while some peeked through the low basement windows to see what was happening on the Soviet-controlled streets. We felt paralysed by the sight of those husky Mongolians, looking wild and frightening. At the ruin across the street from us, the first Soviet orders were posted, including a curfew. Suddenly there was shattering noise outside. Horrified, we watched the Soviets demolish the corner grocery store and throw its contents, shelving and furniture out onto the streets. The Red Army were causing terror across the city, and another woman said, "The frontline Russian troops who did the fighting, as a woman, you didn't have to be afraid of them. They shot every man who they saw, even old men and young boys, but they left the women alone. It was the ones who came afterwards, the second echelon, who were the worst. They did all the assaulting and plundering. They stripped homes of every single possession, right down to the toilet." The Soviet Red Army soldiers caused terror and much fear inside of Berlin. They believed in retribution and believed they could do what they wanted, as many German soldiers had done to Soviet women when they rampaged throughout the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa. They believed that this was what gave them justification to carry out large-scale assaults on one of the final battlefields of the European theatre of the Second World War. Many women were scarred by what happened to them at the hands of the soldiers, and because of this many could not live with themselves and their ordeals after the war. Still today, many old women in Berlin can recall what happened inside of their city, with the Red Army carrying out some of the most horrific and large-scale war crimes seen during the Second World War. Poland as a nation suffered heavily during World War II. It was with the invasion of the land that the conflict began on the continent, and the occupation of Poland was brutal, as the nation was carved up between the Nazis and the Soviets. The Nazis would later violate the pacts that they agreed with Stalin, as they ordered the invasions of the Soviet Union. There were execution squads brought in to slaughter vast swathes of the population, and thousands became victims to the Einsatzgruppe, and with this there were scores of mass execution. The victims were ordered to dig their own graves, huge pits, and they were then ordered to stand inside of them, and executioners then stood either in the pit or on the edge and shot them. They also had to lie down on the bodies of the victims who had gone before them. The Soviets took just over 50% of the territory of Poland, and thousands were made refugees by their actions, and many were forced out. All residents of the annexed area were automatically given Soviet citizenship, and the Soviets encouraged violence against the Polish people. A reign of terror was brought in by the NKVD, and there were huge massacres ordered, and the mass executions were ruthless and efficient. The prisons inside of the Soviet-controlled lands became full with the huge arrests, and many people were sent to Gulag labour camps. But at the end of the war, as the Soviets fought back and pushed the Germans back, Poland became invaded yet again by Soviet forces, who were claiming that they were doing the right thing, pushing the Germans out of their lands. But what came was a targeted campaign of terror inflicted upon the women of the country. There was a serious problem of how Soviet soldiers were treating women inside of lands that they conquered and liberated from the Nazis. Many Soviet soldiers believed they had no sense of punishment, as they were liberating the Polish from the German occupiers, and with this the Red Army men were left to do what they wanted by their commanders. The soldiers marauded into different towns and settlements, and they stole livestock and grain and looted many homes, but they also subjected women to terrifying ordeals. These men were heavily armed, and there were cases of mass assault inside major Polish cities that were taken by the Red Army. In Krakow, when the Soviets entered the city, there were scores of reported assaults of women, as well as a lot of theft. The behaviour continued on such a huge scale that letters were even sent to Stalin to get him to discipline his men, but those who tried to rescue women, who were being subjected to awful ordeals, were executed by the soldiers and were shot. Inside of Silesia this also happened, and there were hundreds of accounts of these crimes, but there were many more thousands that were not reported. There were 30 women who, near to the city of Raciborz, were locked inside of a house after being captured by the Red Army, and over a period of many days they were subjected to terrifying assaults repeatedly. Many women were forced into this, and if not they were threatened with execution. There were women taken from the streets by drunk Soviet men, and inside of towns such as Mazuria and Vormia it continued. The soldiers did not differentiate by age, and there were allegedly women who were as old as 80 who became victims. One Polish woman who worked close to a Soviet garrison in Gdansk claimed, "Because we spoke Polish, we were in demand. However, most victims there were assaulted up to 15 times. I myself was assaulted 7 times. It was horrible." Women then began to hide all day inside the basements to try and survive. There were no instructions by commanders given to treat Polish women well or with respect, and with this some Soviet commanders even tragically excused their men from their actions, seeing it as necessary. In the month of June 1945 this was the worst, and some Soviet soldiers who had fought from Berlin believed they had the right to all Polish women, as they fought for Poland for 3 years, repelling the Nazis. One husband and child were even shot dead, protesting the assault of, it's believed, their mother of the family, and there were more cases inside of Manchuria, and it's believed that there, around 50% of all women suffered from infections caused by the Soviet men. Some women, especially ethnic Germans who had settled in Poland, had managed to flee in the face of the advancing Soviet Red Army, and this left the Polish women to be the ones who were targeted. There were also executions of women, as in January 1945, bodies of women were found in the snow as they had fled a labour camp. Many Polish women were taken to Germany for slave labour, and these were also subjected to terror within Germany at the hands of the Red Army. Many who returned from forced labour inside of the nation also suffered, and they were also seen as spoils of war. Even militiamen and resistors could do little to protect the women, and things were incredibly dangerous. The commandant of a Polish militia headquarters, based in
Trzebitov stated that all women were not to walk outside on their own without the escort of militia soldiers to at least give them some form of protection. A true estimate of the amount of Polish women who were subjected to terrible and shocking ordeals at the hands of the Soviet Red Army cannot be documented due to this sort of behaviour not being recorded by Soviet reports. Historians have tried their best to estimate, and one claims that over 100,000 women were subjected to assault at the hands of the Red Army, but it could be much more. There were some who were executed following their ordeals also, and the behaviour of the Red Army continued to be a problem during the final days of World War II. As they rolled into Berlin, there were shocking accounts of evil directed towards women. One witness said of the events that, "The next morning we women proceeded to make ourselves look as unattractive as possible to the Soviets by smearing our faces with coal dust and covering our heads with old rags, our makeup for the Ivan. We huddled together in the central part of the basement shaking with fear, whilst some even peeked through the low basement windows to see what was happening on the Soviet-controlled street. We felt paralysed by the sight of those husky Mongolians, looking wild and frightening. At the ruin across the street from us, the first Soviet orders were posted, including a curfew. Suddenly there was a shattering noise outside. Horrified, we watched the Soviets demolish the corner grocery store and throw its contents, shelving and furniture out onto the street. The Red Army were causing more terror across the city, and another woman who experienced it said, 'The frontline Russian troops who did the fighting, as a woman you did not have to be afraid of them. They shot every man they saw, even old men and young boys, but they left the women alone. It was the ones who came afterwards, the second echelon, who were the worst. They did all the assaulting and plundering. They stripped the homes of every single possession, right down to the toilet.' This sort of behaviour was exhibited within Poland, and there was little to no protection given to the women of the nation at the hands of those men who believed they were liberating the nation. They were in fact conquering themselves, and they committed many war crimes, but there was little to no reprisal brought against those men who partook in the terrible actions against the women of Poland.
One of the illegal orders given by Adolf Hitler was that all Soviet prisoners of war considered to be commissars and political prisoners were to be given over to the Einsatzgruppen to be shot. However, many men were shot straight away by German forces, and with this many Soviet women lost their husbands and boyfriends and family members without any trial in a horrific war crime. When the Germans invaded on the 22nd of June 1941, no one could have predicted the bloodshed which occurred across the lands, with massacres and horror happening in almost every village and town. The Germans would carry out mass executions and killings with over 1 million Soviet Jews massacred, and many more were killed in huge acts of evil. Also, the Nazis deliberately starved and killed 3.3 million POWs and millions of civilians throughout the lands. Like many armies, as the Wehrmacht advanced throughout different Soviet states and villages, as they wanted to go towards Moscow in the heart of Stalin's government, they committed scores of assaults and horrific actions against the women. Many women were assaulted on a large scale, with the German forces hunting them down and forcing them into horrific situations. Many after their experiences were then executed and killed, and many were rounded up and transported to German military brothels, where they were expected to then tend to the desires of the Wehrmacht forces. Inside of these, much more assault took place, and the women in particular suffered heavily. In many villages they were undefended as the Red Army were retreating, and the men had left their homes to join the war effort against the Germans. As the Blitzkrieg arrived in the Soviet Union, the Germans would go from town to town assaulting and killing, with many women being caught up in the firefighting. Many women involved in resistance were also subject to horrific deaths and executions, with many of these being public to send a strong message out to other people not to resist German occupation or to rise up. Some of these women joined the partisans or resistance groups, who accepted them in the same capacity as men, and they saw service fighting the Germans and also conducting sabotage operations. These assaults had taken place by Wehrmacht forces on Jewish women and girls as early as the invasion of Poland years before, and there were many horrific acts committed against Ukrainian, Belarusian and Russian women. These actions were never really dealt with by the military courts also, and those women who were victims of the Holocaust were more vulnerable to the horror inflicted by the German officers. Many women found themselves kidnapped by the German forces also, as it was said that,
In the city of Smolensk, the German command opened a brothel for officers in one of the hotels, into which hundreds of women and girls were driven. They were mercilessly dragged down the streets by their hair and arms. But many women were also, as well as facing assault, forced to go to their deaths at the hands of the Einsatzgruppen. This mobile killing squad followed the advances of the German army, and then rounded up all the civilians in local areas and villages. With this, they were forced to dig a large pit in a grave on the outskirts, where they were then led into the pit before a firing squad shot them, killing them. Then officers would walk inside the pit, issuing a coup de grace shot to any survivors. Because of this, many women found themselves executed at the hands of the killing squads. There were many protests by local people at this, and one general wrote of the complaints that the conclusion of the report in question contains the following sentence: "In the case in question, measures against women and children were undertaken which in no way differ from atrocities carried out by the enemy, about which the troops are continually being informed. I have to describe this assessment as incorrect, inappropriate and impertinent in the extreme. Moreover, this comment was written in an open communication which passes through many hands. It would have been far better if the report had not been written at all." One SS man who witnessed the killing of many near to the Byala Serkov stated that, "I went to the woods alone. The Wehrmacht had already dug a grave. The children were brought along in a tractor. I had nothing to do with this technical procedure. The Ukrainians were standing around trembling. The children were taken down from the tractor. They were lined at the top of the grave and shot so they fell in it. The Ukrainians did not aim at any particular part of the body. They fell into the grave. The wailing was indescribable. I shall never forget the scene throughout my life. I find it very hard to bear. I particularly remember a small fair-haired girl who took me by the hand. She too was shot later. The grave was near some woods. It was not near a rifle range. The execution must have taken place in the afternoon at about 3:30 or 4 o'clock. It took place the day after the discussions at the Feld Kommandanten. Many children were hit 3 or 4 times before they died. Many Jewish women were being slaughtered across the Soviet Union by the mobile killing squads, and the reality of this was that they had not taken up arms against the German enemy, but they were just caught up in the areas which were occupied. The Germans saw the women inside these places as the spoils of war, and as loot that they could do in fact what they wanted with before they then faced their execution. One excerpt from a war diary states, "The action first scheduled as a training exercise was carried out under real-life conditions in the village itself. Suspicious strangers, especially partisans, could not be found. The screening of the population, however, resulted in 13 Jews, 27 Jewish women and 11 Jewish children, of which 13 Jews and 19 Jewish women were shot in cooperation with the security police." The Jewish population of the Soviet Union and the women were decimated, and those who were kept alive were often assaulted en masse and were forced to vacate their homes and properties so German forces could live in their houses. Often German soldiers burned down the entire settlements and villages in a scorched earth policy, causing havoc and further hatred and fear amongst the Soviet population. The men of the Soviet Union knew all about this, especially the way the women were being treated, and because of this they would later seek revenge inside German-occupied lands, with Soviet forces becoming known for their large-scale assault conducted on the German female population. German forces saw anyone in the USSR as fair game, and much of the crimes committed by them went unreported, and many women were killed immediately after they were assaulted. There were a number of women, though, who did take up arms against the German army and the Wehrmacht. Stalin later reversed the rules, allowing women to join the Red Army and take the fight to the Germans. 800,000 women served in the armed forces. However, if they were captured by the enemy, they were subjected to execution immediately. Hitler and the Nazis saw the use of women in the armed forces as completely backwards and barbaric, deeming them to have no role in the conflict, but if they were captured, then they would be executed straight away. But later in the war, the Red Army would rampage across Germany and commit many more horrific crimes against women. Women and civilians suffered greatly during the Second World War, and the cost to civilian life was greater than military losses, and in particular women suffered at the hands of any occupying forces in any theatre of the conflict. But Operation Barbarossa decimated much of the Soviet Union and the populations living there.
Under the command of Emperor Hirohito, the Imperial Japanese Army and the Navy committed numerous war crimes, which resulted in the deaths of millions of people. It's been estimated that through massacre, starvation, experimentation and forced labour, that between 3 and 14 million civilians were killed. The Japanese became one of the most feared opponents in the history of warfare, and they carried out chemical and biological attacks of warfare, but also when they raided settlements, they decimated everyone in sight. Many of these people were innocent civilians, but the Japanese became fearful of Chinese agents and members of the resistance, so to quash this, they often massacred and executed the men on a huge scale. But many of the victims of the Japanese were women, and how they were treated was completely brutal. One of the most shocking war crimes occurred in Nanking, where the advancing Japanese army caused chaos, and for 6 weeks large-scale looting, killing, arson and assault took place. The massacre is considered one of the worst of the Second World War, and it's estimated that up to 300,000 people were killed inside of the city, and dozens of thousands of assaults on women were documented. It's believed that over 20,000 women were targeted by the advancing Japanese forces, and Japanese forces would go door to door looking for women, and many were captured and then assaulted. Many women in Nanking were then immediately killed after and were treated terribly. One reverend documented this in Nanking saying, "I know not where to end. Never I've heard or read such brutality. We estimate at least 1,000 cases a night and many by day. In case of resistance or anything that seems like disapproval, there is a bayonet stab or a bullet. People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon and evening. The whole Japanese army seems to be free to go and come as it pleases, and do whatever it pleases." A surgeon who worked inside of the university hospital even commented on the slaughter of women and civilians, saying, "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of cases of assault and brutality, almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted corpses are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in without warning or reason and killed 5 of their number and wounded the 2 that found their way to the hospital. Let me recount some instances occurring in the last 2 days. Last night the house of one of the Chinese staff members at the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were assaulted. 2 girls around 16 were assaulted to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, there were about 8,000 people. The Japanese came in 10 times last night, over the wall, stole food, clothing, and assaulted until they were satisfied." He later also wrote, "2 Japanese soldiers have climbed over the garden wall and are about to break into our house. When I appear, they give the excuse that they saw 2 Chinese soldiers climb over the wall. When I show them my party badge, they return the same way. In one of the houses in the narrow street behind my garden wall, a woman was assaulted and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. I managed to get an ambulance so we could take her to the hospital. Last night up to 1,000 women and girls are said to have been assaulted, about 100 girls at the Jinling College alone. You hear nothing but assault. If husbands or brothers intervene, they're shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality of the Japanese soldiers." Many women who were civilians were recruited and forced into becoming comfort women for the Japanese army. These were women who were used inside military brothels in occupied lands. Many were stole from their homes and their homelands and families to be forced to work inside these houses. It's estimated that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were forced into this, and most of the women were from Korea, China and the Philippines, and many women also came from Burma, Thailand, Vietnam and Malaya. These houses were aimed to provide soldiers with women to reduce the number of wartime assaults, which was causing a rising anti-Japanese sentiment in occupied lands, but these comfort stations actually made things worse. Many young women were abducted from their homes and were forced into this, and many were deceived with promises of factory work or working in other establishments such as restaurants. It was said of these houses that these were not commercial brothels. Force explicit and implicit was used in recruiting these women. What went on was serial assault. The Japanese army's involvement is documented in the government's own defence files. A senior Tokyo official apologised for this horrific crime. But still today it's believed that the Japanese have not fully apologised for these crimes of the comfort women. Many of these women were forced to work as comfort women, and they suffered from beatings and other horrors, and many after the war had come to an end suffered for the rest of their lives from the ordeals. Many had PTSD which lasted even 60 years after the war had come to an end. The Japanese forced many Vietnamese women to become comfort women along with the Burmese and Indonesian women. They were forced to work in comfort stations inside of their lands, and even in countries such as North Korea. One Korean comfort woman stayed behind in Vietnam after the war had ended and set up a business owning a dairy farm and diamonds worth around $200,000. Some Japanese soldiers also married comfort women, and many children were born to the comfort women, with them being a product of the horror. There were many diseases that spread around the houses. In terms of recruitment, as mentioned, many women were kidnapped and were rounded up on the streets of Japanese-occupied lands and then transported to become servants and slaves. One former comfort woman stated that there was no rest, it was not a place for humans. But after the war had come to an end, the practice did not stop either. The US authorities allowed for comfort stations to operate in the Pacific past the end of the war, meaning that tens of thousands of women were forced to take American clients also, but Douglas MacArthur shut these down in 1946. There were at least 125 comfort stations, and many of the documents regarding these were destroyed by Japanese officials to cover up their crimes. Many women died from transmitted infections and diseases, or from complications from the violent treatment they suffered at the hands of the Japanese soldiers. Many other women also took their lives as they could not live with the horror. Still today, many former comfort women who are in their 90s speak out about the horrific treatment they suffered at the hands of the Japanese forces. But there were many more atrocities that were committed by the Japanese army against women. In particular was the Bangka Island massacre, in which 22 Australian army nurses were executed on the beach by the Japanese. These women had survived the sinking of the ship the Vina Brook, and many of them had set up a triage tent for the wounded on the beach. The women and the other men went to report to the occupying Japanese forces, and many of the nurses stayed to take care of the wounded in their shelter, which was decorated with a red cross. When the Japanese came towards the beach, they ordered all the wounded men to walk around the headland, where they had set up a machine gun. The men were forced into the sea, and they were all shot dead with the machine gun. The nurses heard the quick succession of gunfire before the Japanese came back towards the women, sat down and then cleaned the blood off their bayonets, and also cleaned their rifles. A Japanese officer then ordered 22 nurses and one civilian woman to walk into the water near where their station was, and as this happened, a machine gun fired into the women. Every single one except for Vivian Bullwinkle was killed and executed in the surf. Bullwinkle survived the war and then documented what happened on Bangka Island, and her evidence was also told at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. There was also evidence that the women were assaulted before they were executed, and Bullwinkle was not allowed to speak about this after the war, and it's claimed she was silenced by the Australian government to not speak about this. But the perpetrators of this crime escaped any form of punishment. But this was just one atrocity committed against women during the Second World War by the Japanese army. Inside of Alexandra Hospital, for example, many women who worked as nurses were killed by the advancing forces and soldiers, and today many of the crimes against women and the torture and horror that they faced have not been brought to life. There were many thousands of women who were killed needlessly and subject to horrific ordeals at the hands of the Japanese, and many soldiers executed and brutally subjected women to barbarism and savagery.
Some of the islands that saw major battles in the Pacific during the Second World War were uninhabited and they had been evacuated, but Okinawa had a large civilian population, many of whom were indigenous. The US believed that there were around 300,000 civilians who lived there, but following the 82-day campaign against the island, there were allegedly 142,058 bodies recovered, and this included many civilians who were pressed into service by the Japanese army. During the fighting, the American soldiers found it difficult to distinguish between civilians and also enemy combatants and soldiers, and they would shoot at the houses on Okinawa. One former soldier wrote, "There was some return fire from a few of the houses, but the others were probably occupied by civilians, and we didn't care. It was a terrible thing not to distinguish between the enemy and women and children. Americans always had great compassion, especially for children. Now we fired indiscriminately." When the Japanese army faced defeat, many people took their own lives, and they believed that falling into the hands of their enemy was the ultimate humiliation and embarrassment for their family. They had learned stories of victorious American soldiers who went on assaulting sprees doing whatever they wanted to the women, and this was the case in Europe also, with the advancing Soviet forces in the final days of the war. They also gained a fearsome reputation, and thousands of civilians on Okinawa were brainwashed by the Japanese propaganda, and they were told that the Americans were there to commit terrible crimes against them. There were many members of the US Army who assaulted Okinawan women during the battle and after. One historian claimed about the large-scale assault that, soon after the US Marines landed, all the women of the village on a peninsula fell into the hands of American soldiers. At the time there were only women, children and old people in the village, as all the young men had been mobilised for the war. Soon after landing, the Marines mopped up the entire village, but found no signs of Japanese forces. Taking advantage of the situation, they began hunting for women in broad daylight, and those women who were hiding in the village or in nearby air raid shelters were dragged out one after another. There were many investigations at the end of the Second World War that did uncover incidents of large-scale assault by the invading forces. A number of elderly people who had lived throughout the battle stated that following the US victory, there were 3 armed Marines who kept coming to their village every week to gather all the local women. These were then carted off to the hills and subjected to terrifying ordeals. This story was considered a dark and long secret. The Japanese forces at the time did not tend to focus their mentality towards these incidents which their enemies had been accused of, and it was claimed that up to 10,000 Okinawan women were subjected to this sort of behaviour at the hands of the Americans. It was a subject that was poorly documented in the history books at the time, but locals recounted many accounts of this sort of behaviour and horror, and some were not willing to talk about what had happened. A number of local books created after the war, and also diaries found, spoke of these shocking incidents. There were in fact less than 10 reported cases in Okinawa, and this was due to a number of reasons, including shame and disgrace, and also because the Americans were the victors and the occupiers, and women believed they could not report the terror to others. It was also claimed that, in all, there were probably thousands of incidents, but the victims' silence kept another dirty secret of the campaign. There were also a number of American Okinawan babies that were born in the time after the battle, but many of these women, shockingly, who found out they were pregnant, were killed, or they were left behind and forgotten about by society and by their villagers because of the shame of having children with the enemy. There were even some radical incidents where victims underwent illegal and rough surgical procedures to deal with this consequence. Many women were very embarrassed because of their treatment, and if they did report their fate to the US military police, they seemingly have been ignored. One Japanese historian documented the story of many of the women of Okinawa during the battle and then the subsequent occupation, and she alleged that even children became victims, and there was in her work roughly 350 crimes documented involving the Americans. One incident involved a woman in April 1945 being abducted when she was evacuating, and another states that a woman who had 2 children was assaulted when she was washing laundry at her home near to a well, and she then gave birth to a boy, presumably the offspring of the US serviceman who terrorised her. There were other incidents in which a 27-year-old woman who was travelling on her way home from work was pushed into a ditch and set upon by 4 men, and this sort of action led to the creation of a civic group known as the Okinawan Women Against Military Violence. Local women knew of many others who remained silent about their suffering, and chose not to do anything, fearful of further action against them. The incidents did not stop when the Second World War came to an end either. Following the Japanese surrender in September 1945, American troops remained as occupying forces, and there were many more accounts of this sort of behaviour continuing. This became so much of a problem in occupied areas that the Japanese government established the Recreation and Amusement Association, which was practically a network of military brothels which catered to the Allied soldiers. These plunged thousands of young women into service in the brothels, and many were forced to see many dozens of men each day. With this, strangely, the accounts of assault went down, but many of these women were treated like comfort women, women who were forced into slavery servicing soldiers during the conflict. One historian claims that the majority of the incidents may have taken place in the northern region, where the fighting and campaign was much less intense, and the American soldiers in the south were experiencing a tougher battle, and many were much more exhausted. He also claimed that the soldiers who landed for occupational duties, rather than the frontline fighters, were the ones who committed more of the attacks. There were in 2023 46 sets of female remains discovered on Okinawa, and these remains dated back to the Second World War. It's believed that these women were either killed in battle or died after being asked to help the army, but there is also a belief that these women could have been local civilians and even Korean comfort women brought to Okinawa to be used by the Japanese military. Those people on Okinawa who did decide to try and live throughout the occupation often found that the American forces in some cases treated them relatively well. However, the women of Okinawa were targeted by a number of soldiers and were subjected to torture ordeals. There had been mass assault on the island conducted by the Japanese forces beforehand, but there were many more stories told in the decades after the war of the horrors that the women faced at the hands of the Americans. This is a forgotten part of the Second World War and what took place in the Pacific, and many would not speak about their ordeal due to the sheer shame that they believed they had around their treatment. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.